we're going to take a deep dive, if you will, into vernal pools here this evening. And hopefully I have given you enough pictures tonight that you will feel like you're in a vernal pool as best we can. And then we'll hopefully get out of here soon enough with a little bit of light left, where if you have a vernal pool close to you, take some time and explore it this evening. It's beautiful out. And so as many of you are probably in a similar situation, this is how I would typically be giving this presentation. We'd have our boots on and we'd be out in the field and we'd be ready to handle some egg masses and look at some critters. But where we're not in that situation, I am going to do my best to kind of create that vernal pool world for you and give you a little bit of perspective as to why I find them so important, both personally and ecologically. Vernal pools have sort of been my constant now for 15 plus years. I started out here in Maine, initially studying sustainable agriculture, and then actually fell in love with vernal pools and the creatures in them. And so, you know, although things are very different right now, that's the elephant in the room. Our lives are very, very different. Our children's schools are disrupted. We're worried about family. The thing that's been constant for me is that springtime call of the wood frog and the springtime call of the peeper. And going to that pool, I have visited time and time again and seeing indeed, although everything is different, there are the egg masses I saw last year and the year before and the year before. And for me, vernal pools have taken on sort of an increasing importance in terms of being a place where I find grounding and inspiration and calmness. So I'm going to share a lot about their ecology today, but I also want to share a little bit about sort of how important they are for me personally as well. So our plan is, very briefly, what is a vernal pool? We're going to meet some of the creatures that live in vernal pools. Then we'll talk a little bit more about the larger ecology of them and why they're important to everything else besides just frogs and salamanders. And then what are some tips for visiting vernal pools safely in your own backyard? So this is a basic question that, like everything in science, has a more complicated answer. So what is a vernal pool? This can be hard to define. There are many different definitions. There are legal definitions, ecological definitions. So I'll do the best I can today to kind of give you a general definition of what they are. And maybe a good place to start with that is thinking about what they're not. So a vernal pool is not a retention basin. It's not a pond. It's not a farm pond. It's not an irrigation pool. It's not a beaver flowage, although some of the creatures that breed or live in vernal pools will sometimes use these important wetlands as well. But it's not a beaver flowage. There's no flow moving through it. And they're not ditches. They're not roadside ditches. They're not skidder ditches. They are a completely different system. Again, sometimes the animals that live in vernal pools will be found in things like roadside ditches, but it's not the ideal place for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is here in a second. They're also not lakes. Some of them can be big, but in general, they're not going to be as big as lakes. And they're certainly not going to have the same types of species and conditions that you would see in a permanent water body. So if you take sort of all the literature that's out there about vernal pools, you can sort of boil them down into 5 key characteristics that are different about them compared with other types of wetlands and other types of aquatic systems. And here are the 5, and we'll go into a little bit more detail of each of these. They have a temporary hydro period. We'll talk about that in a second. They tend to be small, forested, fishless, and they provide breeding habitat for, I think, the coolest animals on the planet. Personal opinion, but I'm going to try to back it up with some data as we go. So key characteristic number 1, temporary hydro period. This is key. This defines everything else that's going on in a vernal pool system. It's this word hydro period. And you just break it apart into 2 parts, hydro and period. So it's basically the amount of time water is in that system, the period of time water is in that system. And so for vernal pools, you could imagine, given their name, they fill in the springtime, vernal meaning spring, with snowmelt and with rainwater. and they hold that water for a temporary period of time, eventually losing that water, usually later in the summer. Sometimes they'll hold it an entire year, but basically they have to dry out at some point every couple of years at the most. Some of them dry out every single year. Others may take a couple years to dry out, but they have to dry out at some point. So that is key because that drives everything else that's happening. And you can imagine right away, having that drying down, it's almost like an intertidal zone where the creatures that live in the intertidal zone on the rocky shores, they're having to deal with these frequent periods of drying and then submersion and drying and submersion. The creatures in vernal pools don't have to deal with that, twice a day, but they're racing against the clock because that pool that's full right now in springtime by August is going to be totally dry. And if you're an aquatic creature, you got to get out of there or you're going to be in trouble. You have to complete your life or you're going to be in trouble. So here is one of my favorite vernal pools from graduate school, my absolute favorite pool in all the world. This is it in May, so right about this time of year. You see where that stick is. Right here where my arrow is, that's over my head. That's about 6 feet deep. So that's May, June, July, August. So 3 months later, same stick, completely dry, except for about, a meter square section right in the center of the pool. So very, very, very different conditions between May and August. Okay, vernal pools tend to be small. Now there's no definition of the size of a vernal pool, but in general, they tend to be smaller than, let's say, 2 acres or so. Again, don't use that as a hard and fast rule, but they tend to be smaller wetland systems. If you think about it, they have to dry down. So a really, really huge wetland likely isn't gonna dry down if you've got a ton of water there. They tend to be small. They're bigger than puddles, they're bigger than ditches in the woods, but they're not huge systems. They also have to be forested. So we talk a lot about vernal pools, but really the system isn't just where the water is. It's more important actually where the forest is, because the pool is just one little part of that whole system. So we talk about a vernal pool system or ecosystem, we mean where the water is, where the basin is, but we're also talking about the forest surrounding that pool as well. The reason the forest is so important for pools, and there's so many reasons why, but I'll go over just a couple, is that they provide shade. You can imagine that in the summertime, as conditions are heating up, that water will get very, very hot and dry down too quickly if you didn't have some shade. At the same time, those trees, as they're growing and their leaves are coming out, they're sucking up some of that water, so they're helping to dry down the pool. As you know, in the fall, many of our trees here lose their leaves. They may lose sticks and things like that, and all that's going into the pool in the form of leaf litter, sticks, logs, and all that stuff that goes into the pool. That's the basis of the food chain in a vernal pool. That's where the pool is getting its nutrients from, those decaying leaves, decaying sticks. And not only that, those leaves and sticks provide places for the critters that live in vernal pools to hide and to lay their eggs. So that forest is helping to feed the vernal pool, and we'll see later, the vernal pool helps to feed the forest. So you have to have the two together. You can't have a vernal pool without the forest, and I suppose you could have a forest without a vernal pool, but I think that would be a less exciting place. Okay, they have to be fishless. Now you can imagine why they end up being fishless, because they dry down and fish are not very happy without water. But more importantly, why it's important that a vernal pool be fishless is that the critters that live in vernal pools have not developed adaptations to escape fish. So what you're looking at right here are spotted salamander egg masses, and we'll talk more about these later. You'll see there's little bits of color on them. This is an experiment I had done. They're marked with little bits of dye so I could track individual masses. But if you look even closer, you'll see little tiny fish in there. Those are all little golden shiners. And what happens is that fish, they see egg masses like this, and this is a delicious buffet of nutrients for them. Now you might ask, well, wait a second, I see bullfrogs in ponds and green frogs. And absolutely, things like bullfrogs, green frogs, mink frogs, pickerel frogs, leopard frogs, they all have skin secretions that make them impalatable to fish, and their eggs and tadpoles do as well. but the critters that we'll meet here in a second do not have those adaptations. So fish eat them, and that's the end of their lives. Okay, the other part that's really important, and it goes beyond just being fishless, is that not only do things that have a temporary hydroperiod, so things that dry down, prevent fish from living in them, it also prevents other creatures from living there that would also have a wonderful field day eating all the vernal pool critters. So in the chat box, you can give it your best guess what you think this green frog here is snacking on. There's a tail, I'll give you that hint, that's sticking out there. And so what happens is not only do, and I'm trying not to say the name of the animal, I'm struggling here, but not only do the critters that live in vernal pools not have adaptations to fish predators, they also don't have adaptations to other amphibian predators. So things like green frogs and bullfrogs, their tadpoles take 2 to 3 years to develop. So they actually have to live in places and develop in places that have permanent hydroperiods. So things like lakes and ponds. But sometimes they travel to vernal pools when they're adults and will feed on things that are living in there. And their tadpoles do as well. So it's very important that that pool dries down to not only kill any fish that might be in there for whatever reason, but also any green frogs or bullfrogs that may have laid their eggs there and have tadpoles hatching out, ready to munch on whatever it is they can find. So the fifth and final characteristic we'll cover tonight is breeding habitat. And this is the one to me that's particularly interesting, because this is where we get to talk about living stuff, the animals that I find fascinating. So in Maine, vernal pools provide breeding habitat for 4 key animals. 4 key groups of animals that we're going to talk about today. I'm going to focus on 2 of them pretty extensively. But those 4 animals are fairy shrimp here, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and blue spotted salamanders. So our first, and I'm going to call them indicator species because they're indicating that you likely have a vernal pool. And this one for sure, if you find these guys, chances are you have a vernal pool. So fairy shrimp, if you guys have ever had sea monkeys, that's the closest analogy there is to these critters right here. So we have at least 2 species of them here in Maine. And basically what they are small, 1.5 inch long critters. They swim on their backs and they are this interesting kind of burgundy reddish orangish color. And they're active, some of the first species to be active in a vernal pool. Sometimes you see them swimming underneath the ice. They have to have very, very cool temperatures to hatch and to be active. You usually don't even see them once it gets above 70 degrees or so. And basically they have a very quick life of about 2 weeks of breeding and feeding, mating, and then they're dead. They've laid their eggs and then they die. And those eggs basically can persist in that water throughout the rest of the season. They can dry out, they can stay dormant for multiple years. And then for whatever reasons, temperature, concentrations of different things in the water, oxygen, all that kind of stuff has to be the right conditions for them to hatch out again. So they're called fairy shrimp because they're like fairies. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't, and it's like magic when they appear. Of all of the pools that I visited in my lifetime, I can only count a handful that I've seen fairy shrimp in. And so if you find them, it's a very, very special, a special occurrence. If you have seen fairy shrimp in your life, put that in the chat box. I would love to know how many folks have come across these guys. And I can say, the pools that I've studied, even though I might see them in 1 year, I come back the next year, they're not there the following year, and then boom, all of a sudden they're there again. So they tend to also be associated with really high quality, clean water, oxygenated water pools. Second species we're going to talk about, you guys may have heard these guys very prominently over the last couple weeks, is the wood frog. So the wood frog is my second favorite species. We'll get to my favorite species in a second. But I think these guys are such an interesting little critter. So they have this very telltale brown colored triangular mask behind the eye and this white lip line. Nothing else in Maine is going to have that. They can be a variety of different colors, tannish to reddish, but nothing else is going to have that telltale mask around the eye. And so here's a question for the chat box. So what sound do I make? This is the one that, you hear the classic question of, it sounds like I've got a duck in my backyard, but it's April. How can it possibly be a duck? And I don't have a pond, so what is it? You may already know the answer to this. It's probably a chorus of wood frogs calling. So I will try to not torture you too much with my wood frog call. But if you have not heard it, I will do my best. They are still calling right now in some parts of the state, but it really does sound like a quack. It's a like that. Obviously, I've spent way too much time by myself making that sound in the forest. But they, if you're standing in the middle of them, it is astounding to think of a critter that's this small making such a loud, loud chorus. And you'll notice this time of year in particular, I don't know if you can see this guy. See, this is a male, and he's got this very skinny waist. And what happens is this time of year when they're arriving on the breeding site, and we'll go through the life cycle in a second, the males haven't eaten. They have one thing in mind, and it's basically having babies. And so they don't stop to eat. They don't stop to do anything else. They go right for the vernal pool. And so when you see them this time of year, the time of year, they have these really skinny little waists. So they can be about 2.5 inches long. Here's a male breeding a female. The females this time of year tend to have this more reddish hue. The males tend to be more tannish or brown. The females also tend to look like they're pregnant. They have these rounder bellies. They're called gravid. So that's another way you can often tell a male from a female, is that reddish color and the rounder belly that's full of eggs. So what happens this time of year is you have these adults that they've been hanging out in the upland most of the year. They're called vernal pool animals, but really they're forest animals because they spend 98% of their lives in the upland, in the forests. So this time of year, March through April, they're moving down into the vernal pool, usually a night where you have temperatures around 42 degrees or so, maybe a light rain. They start moving from the forest into the pool, where they all tend to breed at once. They're called communal or explosive breeders, safety in numbers to avoid getting eaten. And so basically this huge progression, they move sort of en masse to the pool, breed very quickly, and then they're out of there. They lay their eggs, and we'll talk a little bit about how to identify eggs in a couple of slides here. But they lay these eggs, and everything, keep in mind what I said about hydroperiod. The hydroperiod drives everything else going on in these systems. They are racing against the clock. From the time the snow stops melting and the spring rains stop falling, that pool is drying. And so everything that happens after has to happen quickly. So they lay those egg masses. The females lay the egg masses on sticks, branches, things like that. And they hatch out in about 2 weeks, very quickly, to go from this little tiny dot that's an embryo into a tadpole. Takes about 2 to 3 months for those tadpoles to develop. And they develop into little tiny miniature frogs called metamorphs. And so those little tiny miniature wood frogs start hopping out of the vernal pool around July or August and hopping into areas like forested wetlands to feed and to summer so they don't get too hot, but they're pretty much sticking kind of close to that vernal pool in the first year. And then they'll move up into the upland and have about 2 to 5 years of a life before they inevitably get eaten or die of old age. So not a very long life cycle, but really it's spent primarily in the upland. Once they get out of that pool as metamorphs, they're spending most of their life here in the forest or in a forested wetland, except for those couple of nights up to a week that they're breeding in the springtime. You guys have probably seen these egg masses. I wish I had you in front of me so I could see you guys nodding your heads about whether or not you'd seen these things. But chances are you may have come across these. I think that they look like, this might be gross, but like bubbling brains is what I think of and how I describe it to my kids and students that I've taken out in pools. And it's, if you handle one of these, a lot of this is about texture when you're trying to tell the difference between amphibian species. These feel really kind of loose. Like you wouldn't want to throw it. You don't want to throw it anyway. Please don't throw these. But if you had the urge to throw it, this one you wouldn't want to throw. You could anticipate it falling completely apart. So these are eggs, individual eggs, and these are the little embryos, the black dots within the egg. And oftentimes you see these egg masses laid together. Right now where you guys are at, probably seeing a lot of hatching happening already, but there are definitely some parts of the state, like I said, northern Maine, western Maine, where wood frogs are still laying egg masses. They'll lay them in these big communal clusters all together. So these are hundreds of eggs that you're seeing right here. And they lay them together similar to breeding all together. It's safety in numbers. If you're this egg mass here in the center, you're less likely to get eaten by a great blue heron that's picking along the edges around here. The other really important thing about this big communal mass is that it warms up faster. Because those embryos are that dark, dark color, they're absorbing more solar radiation and they're heating up faster. And they're heating up faster because they're in this big dark group that allows them to heat up faster. And so again, it's driven by that trying to develop quickly into tadpoles so that they can then turn into little tiny froglets to get out of that pool before it dries down. And what you see on the surface of the water isn't always the whole story. If you actually lift up the egg masses, if you're trying to count how many egg masses you have, you often see layers upon layers upon layers as you dig down into the water. So this is a frog's eye view of what you might be seeing in terms of egg masses. So I'm going to move on to my absolute favorite species in all the world. I think they are cooler than whales. I think they are cooler than bears. I think they are the neatest species. Because they're faced with so many different challenges, and yet they find a way to make it through. And I hate to personify an animal like that, but I find these critters fascinating. So the third species that we'll talk about, we've talked about fairy shrimp, we've talked about wood frogs. Now this third one of the four that we'll talk about is the spotted salamander. Some people call them yellow spotted salamanders, as you can imagine why, because they have yellow spots, but I just call them spotted salamanders. So kind of a similar life history to the wood frog with some differences. They also are more of a forest creature than they are, an aquatic creature living in a vernal pool. They spend most of their lives in upland habitats. They live in little burrows created by other animals, vole holes, mouse holes, things like that. And in the springtime, they start, again, like wood frogs, moving down to the vernal pool around this time of year, April through May. So where wood frogs all kind of arrive en masse and sort of breed and do what they need to do over a week period or so, these guys take longer. So most of these guys are arriving at the pool at once, maybe about 50 to 60% of them are arriving around the same time. But the remaining are kind of trickling in later and earlier, deviating a little bit from when most of the animals are all arriving at that pool at the same time. So a longer breeding period, you'll see new egg masses occurring over a period of weeks, a little bit slower than wood frogs, but pretty much this time of year, April to May. And then they're out of there, just like wood frogs. The adults are there to breed, lay eggs, and they're out. And you may have heard of something called Big Night. And Big Night is a fascinating and amazing event if you can witness it. So it's basically, and we call it Big Night, but there's often more than one big night. So we have big nights, plural. And what it is when there are the right conditions, a little bit of rain, warm night over 42 degrees or so, where these animals are moving to the pools en masse. And so what you'll see are these amazing nuptial dances you may have heard of in the water, where the males will nudge the females, will nudge the snouts. And it's this moving mass of salamanders kind of dancing all together in preparation for egg laying and mating. And the other thing, so a lot of people have observed Big Night. There are great videos of it on the web, but something that you can't really observe from the web that I encourage you to try sometime is if you have a warm night where you feel like you're gonna have some salamanders moving or frogs moving, is to sit near a vernal pool and just listen. And often what you can hear, it sounds like the forest is alive. What you are hearing are these animals moving through the leaf litter toward the vernal pool. And you'll hear this, it's almost, if you didn't know what it was, it might be kind of scary because you think, oh dear, zombies. But no, it's salamanders quietly moving through the leaf litter and frogs moving through the leaf litter to the vernal pool. Very cool experience if you can catch it. Okay, so the adults go, lay the eggs, boom, they're gone. The larvae of these guys take about 2 to 4 months to hatch and turn into larvae. Again, they're staying in that pool the whole time, just like wood frogs are, but still racing against the clock. And then they leave a little bit later than wood frogs, so late July or September. And just like wood frogs, they're little tiny miniature versions of the adults, little teeny tiny spotted salamanders. They leave, head to the upland, just like wood frogs do, and spend most of their time in the upland until they're ready to breed. And these guys to me are fascinating because even though they're small, they're only, 6 to 8 inches long, they can live up to 20 years. In studies that we did here in Maine, you can actually take a sample of the toe bone and you can cross-section it and stain it and look at it under a slide. And you can count the rings on that bone, just like you would tree rings on a tree stump, and figure out how old that salamander was. And so in Maine, we are seeing salamanders that were 16, 17, 18 years old. And so if you can imagine all those journeys that little salamander has taken to the pool, back to the forest, back, and not gotten eaten by an owl or a raccoon or a mink or all the different predators that are out there, or dried out or gotten smushed by a car. To me, that is phenomenal. That something that small, that is that much at risk from so many different things, can live to 20 years. Like I said, they can be about 8 inches long or so. The older they get, the bigger they get. And right now, it's fairly easy to tell males from females. The males tend to be kind of like the wood frogs, a bit skinnier, and their spots. This isn't a great photo, but this one we can really tell here how bright his spots are. Bright, bright yellow, so that's a male. Females tend to have less bright spots, duller spots, and they tend to be just like with the wood frog, have these big bellies, just like when I was pregnant, big belly, because she is ready to lay eggs. So she is full of eggs that are ready to be fertilized, ready to be laid in the vernal pool. So if you see a salamander with a big belly like this, spots that aren't very bright, chances are that's a female that is headed toward a vernal pool to lay eggs. Their egg masses are really, really fascinating. I could go on way too long about them, but I won't in the interest of time. But they're quite different if you get a chance to handle them. Again, you might be tempted. Please don't throw them. But if you hold one, it would feel like, okay, this is something I could probably throw and it wouldn't fall apart right away. Again, not encouraging it, but you'll know the sensation when you hold it. It's like this thing is fairly solid. It feels like really hard, not hard, but really stiff Jello, I guess is the way to phrase it. And what's interesting and a really cool adaptation is that these are the actual eggs themselves. You see this copper colored embryo surrounded by the yolk and the egg itself. But then outside of that, there's an additional layer called an egg mass membrane. And that protects everything inside of it from predators, from drying out. Keep in mind, these guys take a little bit longer to develop in a pool. Their young are leaving the pool in September. And so they have more of a risk of that pool drying out before they totally make it through. So having an egg mass that can withstand a lot of different sort of drying regimes and temperatures and things like that helps protect them in systems where they might be hanging out a little bit longer than something like a wood frog. Sometimes, well, oftentimes actually, they will lay their egg masses together, usually not in as big of clusters as you see wood frogs, where you'll see, hundreds of egg masses together. Sometimes you'll see groups of 20, 30, 40 of these spotted salamanders all together. And you can see here, we'll do a quick count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Same thing, tend to lay on branches like wood frogs do. Sometimes you'll see these guys, rather than being on the surface of the water like wood frogs, sometimes they'll be deeper in the water. I've actually found them in ponds up to 15, 20 feet deep. And they hatch out and do just fine. Again, because they're not racing against the clock quite as much as wood frogs, they don't have to be quite as close to that surface of the water to heat up as quickly as the wood frogs do. Their wood frogs are moving much, much faster through their life cycle than these guys are. So here's a little quiz for you guys to see if you can spot the egg mass. Hopefully it jumps right out to you, right about there. There's a lot of other stuff to look at in the pool too. But this is a fairly easy one to spot because it's got this cloudy-ish color that we'll talk about here in a second. Spotted salamanders actually their egg masses come in 2 different colors. Just like humans have all sorts of different colors of skin and colors of hair, spotted salamanders have egg masses that come in different hues. And so they will either lay clear masses or cloudy masses, and it's actually a genetic variation. It's a protein that occurs, and these in females that lay cloudy masses, that does not occur in females that lay this clear mass. And it's fine, both are viable. There are some theories out there about how this cloudiness can actually protect the embryos from visual predators. Other studies have shown that this cloudiness actually makes it a lot easier to see the egg mass, like we saw in this photo here. So those studies haven't quite settled the question of why do we have these different appearances. But oftentimes you will see both of these egg masses with this greenish hue, and that's a good thing. It's actually a symbiotic algae that occurs in the female's reproductive tract, and it's laid along with the egg mass. And that algae provides oxygen for those developing embryos as they're in that egg mass for, a month or so at a time. And studies have shown that embryos that are way deep down inside of this egg mass, because of that protective outer jelly, if it wasn't for that symbiotic algae, they wouldn't get enough oxygen to survive. So that symbiotic algae is actually a really, really good thing. If you see a green egg mass, chances are it's a good thing. The other thing to look out for this time of year, beyond looking for egg masses, is the occurrence of these little tiny, I call them towers, or little tiny cones. And these are called spermatophores. And when you look in a pool, they may not jump out at you right away as something important. They may look to you like little bits of lichen. I get fooled so many times looking for these things. I think that they're little bits of, I think that they are these little spermatophores, and really it turns out to be lichen. But oftentimes what you will see is a cluster of these little white dots all together, maybe about 30 or 40 or so of them. And what they are little tiny sperm packets laid by the male. So the males will arrive at the pools first, often will lay these little sperm packets awaiting the females to arrive. So I'll use this as sort of my early detection system. If I think that I have a pool where there are spotted salamanders there, I will look for these first before I even start looking for egg masses. Because these, like I said, the males will start laying these before the females even get there. Okay, I'm just gonna spend a minute on this species here in the interest of time, but this is another really fascinating species, much rarer here in Maine, the blue spotted salamander. You can see characterized, instead of having yellow spots, more of this marbled blue pattern. Very similar in life history to the spotted salamander. The difference with these guys is that most of what we have here on the landscape is a hybrid version, where spotted salamanders, blue spotted salamanders, have bred with a different kind of salamander that we don't have here, called a Jefferson salamander, and produce these blue hybrids over time. The blue one, the hybrids tend to be a little bit bigger, a little bit browner. The pure ones that have not interbred with the Jefferson salamander tend to be smaller and more of a pure blue color. These are much, much rarer on the landscape. In general, blue spotted salamanders are rare to begin with, but the pure ones are particularly rare. Their egg masses are, even though they're salamanders, they still have this protective jelly that goes all the way around their individual eggs. But their egg masses are very different. You wouldn't want to throw them, not as solid. And to me, it looks like, if you remember the movie Ghostbusters, when Slimer comes and he slimes the library, and there's like that Slimer goo hanging off of everything. That's what their egg masses look like to me, like Slimer goo hanging off of branches. And if you look at them up close, the pure blue spotted salamanders lay very, very few eggs together. This is an egg mass here, only containing 4 embryos. The hybrid ones tend to lay more eggs in an egg mass, so anywhere from 15 to 20, 25, and they tend to be swirled around branches in that shape. So that's another way to tell them apart. This is a species that, if you're in a vernal pool looking for things, be very, very careful, because these egg masses are super, super hard to find. Okay, we're gonna put all the characteristics of the pool together. So we talked about a pool needs to have a temporary hydro period, fills with water in the spring, dries by the fall. It needs to be forested to feed that pool and to provide shade and spots for females to lay their eggs and spots for larvae to hide. Can't have fish because the fish would eat everything. And because you have all those things together, it provides breeding habitat for unique species that really breed best in vernal pools, but most of the time live in the surrounding forest. Okay, so where are they found? This is sort of the classic definition of a vernal pool, an isolated upland depression. So you're walking through the forest and you come upon this sort of magical pond in the middle of nowhere. Tends to sit in a saddle around, surrounded by small hills that are basically providing the drainage down into that pool. So that's sort of the classic definition of a vernal pool. But you can also find them as depressions in bigger wetland complexes. So this is a depression in a shrub swamp, but it has a little bit more water than the surrounding part of the wetland and it dries out. And then floodplain vernal pools are really interesting. These are depressions in floodplains that when a river overtops its banks in the spring, fills that depression, and then as the river recedes, it basically breaks the connection with that pool, and you have this isolated basin in that floodplain. Now this is where drying down is really important, because sometimes if you have a river overtop its banks, fish might occasionally get into that vernal pool. But if that pool dries down by August, those fish are not going to be able to reproduce. And so floodplain vernal pools can occasionally have fish in them, but they're not going to have fish that are going to survive for very long. So I want to talk a little bit here about sort of the bigger role of vernal pools in the ecosystem, and then we'll talk about how to find pools, what are some of the tools and things that you need to do so, and then we'll wrap it up with questions. So like I've said probably way too many times already, but that the pool is not just the pool. It's not just the water. It's really the pool plus a lot of the forest that's around it. And the pool and the forest surrounding it are home to many more things than just the critters that we talked about, those 4 indicator species: fairy shrimp, wood frogs, spotted salamanders, and blue spotted salamanders. Those are the key things that we're looking for when we're trying to figure out if a vernal pool, if a water body is a vernal pool, because those things don't tend to breed successfully in other places. But vernal pools are also really important for many, many other things. So 11 of our 17 frog and salamander species use vernal pools at some point during their lives. Things like spring peepers and toads and tree frogs will be found in vernal pools. You can often hear peepers also breeding in vernal pools and calling from them this time of year. Great way to be able to find a vernal pool is to listen for the call of peepers and wood frogs. But also our reptile species, 9 of our 17 reptile species use vernal pools, many of these species are listed as either state threatened or endangered. We have 10 species in Maine that are at risk, like I said, either threatened or endangered or a special concern species that use vernal pools during some part of their life cycle, things like spotted turtles and Blanding's turtles. Different species of dragonflies will also use vernal pools and are only found in vernal pools as well. So it's not just things like frogs and salamanders, it's also invertebrates as well. Things like ribbon snakes that only occur in vernal pools. Not necessarily a charismatic species that people are looking out for, but it's something that's only found in vernal pools you're not going to find elsewhere in other types of water bodies. But beyond sort of those key threatened and endangered and at-risk and charismatic sort of species, there's many, many other things that are found in vernal pools that have been accounted for. So over 500 different species of invertebrates will use vernal pools, things like fingernail clams, dragonflies, phantom midges, and caddisflies are found in vernal pools as well. Then if we really scale up, it's not just little stuff, it's big stuff. It's also found in vernal pools. So I was fortunate enough to go to graduate school with, as many people have referred to her as sort of the mother of vernal pools, Dr. Aram Calhoun. And she used to say, if you follow a moose trail in the springtime, you are going to find a vernal pool. And I only have anecdotal evidence to back that up. I don't know if anyone's ever tested that, but sure enough, oftentimes you will find moose trails leading to vernal pools. We have lots of camera footage that shows them in vernal pools because they're oftentimes the first places to green up in the spring and provide fresh green vegetation for moose. And certainly vernal pools provide important habitat for other species too. Things like black ducks. This is a nest from a vernal pool in Brunswick. This is a fairly wonderful thing to stumble upon in the spring, where you're looking for frogs and amphibians, and all of a sudden there's this beautiful fluffy down nest in front of you of black ducks. But things like great blue herons and bitterns will use vernal pools. And so it's about what that vernal pool itself is providing for a whole different suite of species on the landscape. But then it's also how that pool provides stuff to the surrounding landscape as well. And if you look at the movement distances of the animals that are using vernal pools and breeding in vernal pools, it helps paint the picture of how connected that water body is to the rest of the landscape. So if we look at spotted salamanders, for example, we talked about their sort of life history of moving into the pool for breeding and moving back out into the landscape. We also talked about wood frogs doing the same thing. If we look at sort of the average distances they're traveling every year between the pool and the surrounding landscape, if you take a look at a spotted salamander here, for example, they're traveling close to 400 feet a year back and forth from that pool to the forest, pool to the forest. Wood frogs are traveling even farther, over 600 feet every single year. And there's so much movement going on the landscape between that pool and the forest that, like I said, you really can't separate that pool from the forest. In some of the studies that we did in down east Maine, we actually found that salamanders were moving so much on the landscape that if we looked at the genetics of all the salamanders within a 5-kilometer radius of a vernal pool, they were all genetically related. We could not separate populations. And this is across roads and over a pretty steep mountain. There's that much movement going on in the landscape and interbreeding. And to me, and I'm biased because I think amphibians are so cool, but to me, this migration that we see every year rivals things that you see covered in National Geographic, okay? So we've probably all heard about the famous caribou migrations in Alaska, where these caribou are moving, 2,000 to 6,000 kilometers. But if you scale down the size of a caribou to the size of a wood frog, the wood frog migration is actually, relative body size wise, the wood frog migration is actually farther. So if you blew up a wood frog to be the size of a caribou, to weigh the same amount as a caribou, it would actually be traveling a little bit farther than caribou actually travel in real life. But it's all happening at this tiny, tiny, tiny little scale. And it's a migration that rivals anything else that we see in North America. And it's happening here in our own backyards. And I think because it's at a smaller scale, we don't realize how epic and huge this is for the creatures that are doing it. And as they're moving out of the pool, they're moving stuff into the forest. Not just the adults that are going to the pool to lay their eggs and then heading back into the forest, but all those eggs that hatch out into tadpoles and then move into the forest. That's also moving stuff, nutrients, out into the surrounding landscape. So biomass is basically the weight of the stuff, the biological or living material in an area. And so for vernal pools that are basically, centers of biomass production, studies have shown 1.4 tons of biomass can be generated from a single pool. That's a lot of nutrients, fertilizer basically, that's going into the surrounding landscape. And if you add up all the biomass of amphibians in the forest in the Northeast, it actually exceeds that of birds and other vertebrates. So put all the moose together, put all the birds together, put them on a scale, put amphibians on the other side. Amphibians would actually outweigh all those moose and birds. And so if you can imagine, if all those amphibians disappeared from the landscape, if we removed all the vernal pools from the landscape, that's a lot of stuff that's not ending up in the rest of the forest. Just to kind of demonstrate how some of that stuff ends up in the surrounding forest and in the rest of the food chain. These couple of photos here were taken by a colleague of mine in grad school. But vernal pool critters are the basis of the food chain for a lot of other stuff. So spotted salamanders, for example, are a good snack for things like garter snakes, as are wood frogs. But also, if you think about some of the invertebrates that live in vernal pools are also feasting on what's in there. Vernal pools I think of as being sort of like the rest stops in this big forest highway. Probably healthier than a lot of the food you can get in rest stops, but these big concentrations of nutrients. And so where you have here the spotted salamander egg mass, and next to it here in my hand is a caddisfly. And this caddisfly is basically munching on all these little embryos here. Well, of course, that caddisfly is eventually going to develop into an adult and fly away from the pool. So it's taking the nutrients from this egg mass and taking it elsewhere into the forest. So vernal pools are really just this powerhouse of nutrients that are concentrated in one area, but end up pretty much fertilizing the rest of that forest, either through the animals themselves moving into the forest and eating other things and producing droppings and everything else that fertilize the ground, but also as being food for other things in the surrounding environment. Of course, we have to think about vernal pools and climate change and what might happen to these systems. And so I'm going to leave you with a couple thoughts here and then we'll wrap it up. But we're dealing with a system, by definition, that's very dynamic and that's based on things like snowpack and rainfall patterns. And of course, if you've read vernal pool literature, those are two things that are likely to be affected in Maine pretty significantly with changing climate. So looking at reduced snowpacks, looking at flashier rainstorms during the winter time, less rain in the summertime. And so you can imagine that vernal pool hydro periods may be affected by a changing climate, potentially with pools in general being drier. And so that may be an issue for some of the species that are closely timed their development with the filling and drying of a vernal pool, and risking potentially pools drying earlier than one would have expected. Now obviously their life history is going to adapt as well, hopefully, to changing conditions. But I think probably one of the best strategies we can do, where there's still a lot of unknowns about how climate change will affect vernal pools, I think one of the best strategies we can do is really think at a landscape scale of conserving different types of vernal pools on the landscape, different types of wetlands on the landscape, so that if you have vernal pools, little ones that tend to dry every single year, maybe right here in this part of the landscape, maybe those guys tend to dry more often, but produce some organisms a few times every couple of years. But we also want to make sure on the landscape we have some other pools, maybe larger pools that hold water for longer, and maybe one pool that only dries down once every 3 to 4 years. But really thinking about having a variety of different vernal pools on the landscape of different hydro periods to hedge our bets, to have some options out there, keeping in mind that the animals that breed in here are moving around on the landscape. So making sure they have access to these different potential breeding areas, I think is one of the most powerful strategies we can take when we don't know exactly how climate change will affect vernal pools and the organisms that breed in them. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here with a couple hints and tips for exploring vernal pools. So I think vernal pools, again, you might have caught on to me having an affinity for vernal pools, but I really do think they are the best science classroom that's out there. They tend to be small, they tend to be easy to find, they tend to be rather contained, and they tend to be, fairly shallow. So they're sort of a fun, neat thing that you can see kind of all at once. So when should you go? Right now. That is my best advice. Go right now. So we've divided the state into 3 different regions: northern region, central, and southern region. So you guys are, I suspect most of you are kind of right here straddling the cusp of the two. So, you know, right now, most of the wood frogs are finishing up their breeding. There might be some colder pools, more forested pools where you're still seeing wood frogs breeding. But right now, we're right sort of in the thick of salamander breeding. So right now is a great time to go see spotted salamanders and potentially see some older wood frog masses and hatching wood frogs. But just to think through some things before you go, if you don't have your own vernal pool, or you don't have a vernal pool on lands that you've been to before, talk to the landowner. If you know of a vernal pool, but you're not sure what the history is, the ownership is, just make sure to talk to that landowner and get permission to look at that pool. Other places to consider, things like land trust properties and other types of public areas are fantastic places to visit. Your local land trust, I'll put a plug in for that again. Your local land trust will often have great specimen vernal pools. Talk to outreach staff there and ask. Wildlife management areas owned by our department. We will purchase lands in the state in part because they provide habitat for things like amphibians and birds and all sorts of other types of animals. So feel free to ask me or a regional biologist for suggestions on good vernal pools that might be in a nearby wildlife management area. Essential gear, not a whole lot. There's really just two things to think about. Have some boots. If you have chest waders, even better, especially if you're, you know, if you're like me and you get excited and you want to catch a frog and you go up over your boots every single time, like I do. Every time I go in a pool, I always get wet if I don't wear my chest waders. Bug nets are starting to become more important here as we go on the next couple weeks, but not necessary. Definitely, but the boots are. I think the, you know, you don't need this. This is cool, but you don't necessarily need scuba gear to sample a vernal pool. Although I have sampled vernal pools in scuba gear when they are deep. Fascinating to be able to do, kind of fun, but that's overkill, just a pair of boots. The other really important piece of gear, if you can't have anything else besides your boots, is a pair of, I call them my super secret spy glasses. Basically what they are polarized sunglasses. These are key because in order to see things like fairy shrimp that basically are small and hard to see if there's a lot of glare on the water, egg masses, things like that. These are key to being able to see. I call them my X-ray vision, to see down through the surface of the water. Other things you might keep in mind, things like binoculars if you have a big pool and you might see birds across the way, a dip net for catching things, a field guide. I have some references at the end, but this is a great field guide. I think it's the easiest to use, great photos, not very big, light. You can put it in your backpack. Kenny and Burns, fantastic guide. Ziploc bags, if you do catch something, let's say you catch a frog, you want to be really cognizant of making sure you don't have sunscreen or bug spray or lotions or anything like that on your hands. Sometimes it's best if you do catch a frog, put it in a bag. Obviously, make sure there's air in there, but then you can hold it up and look at it, examine it, and then let it go. And that way you're not touching it and getting your own oils and things all over its skin. I should add on here, think about tick protection, because obviously that's a very important thing to keep in mind. You guys have probably heard many suggestions on how best to prepare yourself for ticks, but that's probably the #1 thing to be cautious of when you're looking in a vernal pool, is that the ticks are probably looking at you. Things to think about during your visit. So stick to the edge of the pool. Sometimes they can be deep. You don't want to step in and not know how deep it is. Sometimes you might go to a pool that was actually an old quarry or an old borrow pit that's very deep. So stick to the edge if you can, particularly if you have kids with you. Also, in terms of not crushing stuff, those blue spotted salamander eggs, hard to see. So if you can stick to the edge, try as best you can. And then if you don't know where to start on the north side. The reason being is that on the north side, particularly in early spring, that's the side of the pool that's going to get the most solar radiation. And so that's where the frogs are going to be laying their eggs first, to try to capitalize on that warmer water. So start there and move around from there. And the other thing I would recommend, and this can be hard with little ones sometimes, but you can incorporate it sometimes into, practicing observations and things like that, is to sit still. and to look for movement and to listen. Because sometimes what you'll notice is you'll arrive at the pool and you won't hear anything because you've startled everything. But as you sit and you become part of that landscape and you're quiet and you observe, that's when you can start to see things like fairy shrimp swimming around and wood frogs swimming. And occasionally, if you're really lucky, a spotted salamander swimming. So just try to take the time as best you can to be quiet and to observe. And I'll say the other thing about this photo is cloudy days can sometimes be great days, because if you have your polarized glasses, the glare isn't as bad and you can see really well into the pool. Lots of resources out there. We'll post this presentation so you'll have links to it. Lots of great guides. This is the one I mentioned before. That's a fantastic resource to take with you. But we also have, this is a wonderful book that talks way more in detail about these different species I mentioned today, Maine amphibians and reptiles. And these are other really great in-depth books about vernal pools. And then I'll just leave it with this, sort of on the personal note, that you may have picked up on the fact that I really love vernal pools. I think they're fascinating. I think having this amazing migration happening in our backyard that's contained on this really small scale, that's accessible. You don't have to pay someone $2,000 to travel there. It's right here. It's all around us. And it's such a powerful place to introduce kids to the outdoors. Ever since both my kids were in utero, they've been going to pools with me. And so here's my daughter pictured here from the time she was little to recently. And, you know, it's something that as a family we've discovered together, and we love it. And year after year, we go back to the same vernal pools. It's part of our spring routine. This is my son here. This was when he was a couple months old, doing a field visit with me. And again, here, where it's something that they look forward to in the spring and they want to do. And it's something that we return to again and again. And for me, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's been a real refuge, particularly during this really uncertain time. It's been that place that I go to that I know the frogs are here again, the salamanders are here again. Even if everything else feels really crazy and out of control, this I know is okay. And I was thinking a little bit for myself, 10 years ago, I was doing this work, and here I am 10 years later, 11 years later, still going to vernal pools, still finding that excitement, and still seeing them as a refuge. And so I would just urge you, if you have some time to explore a vernal pool, take some time, check it out, think about the worlds that are going on in that pool and in the forest around it, and pause and take some time to kind of drink that in and soak that in. And I hope that that gives you in your lives some joy and some comfort and some peace like it does for me. So that's all I have. My contact info is here. Feel free to call. This is my cell phone because we are not in the office. Feel free to call that number, or certainly feel free to email me with any questions. And I will stop sharing my screen now and we can answer some questions.